and that it is perhaps in our best interest that they not fail. We could develop and execute plans to help non-Indians who are trapped in short-term goal-seeking. What does that mean? Many of the people in the anti-Indian movement are caught between a rock and a hard place themselves. Many of them, right over here in Lillooet country, right over here in country next to this city, came and bought property, and they didn't know that so-called crown land was Indian land. And then somebody said, wait a minute, this is Indian land, you can't live here. And they'd already lived there for 20 years. And Canada didn't say, oh, I'm sorry, I misled you. These people need help, just every bit as much as Indian country, and we need help. They need to understand their dilemma, but they also need to understand an alternative to fighting the Indian, because the Indian is not the cause of their problem. A decision made in 1969 in Ottawa is the cause of their problem. And perhaps it should be reversed. Perhaps Canada could lead in the understanding of its collective role as protecting all human beings inside of its boundaries, and respecting all human beings inside its boundaries, and consulting with all human beings inside its boundaries. Canada has one of the best propaganda machines in the world. For those of you who have not been outside the United States, know it. Those of us, I'm sorry, outside of Canada, I have watched it. It is a wonderful system. If I didn't know better, I would think that their streets flowed with milk and honey. And all of your prime ministers should receive the Human Rights Award.
Yeah, right.
There is, after 14 years of discussion in Geneva and perhaps a dozen other places in the world, a thing called the International Covenant on the Rights of Indigenous Nations that was drafted in Geneva in 1994 and initialed by nations there. And it is being sent all around the world for nations themselves to consider and ratify. It is the first piece of new international law specifically drawn up by and for ratification by nations themselves. It is being done in the spirit of nations assuming and resuming their responsibility in international affairs. Many of you may ask yourself, what the heck are you talking about, them resuming their responsibilities in international affairs? Let me just say, for those of you who may not have noticed in the history books, before there were states, there were nations, and they're still here. All that happened is that many states were formed on top of nations. And now they have their role to play again. They made all the original international laws. States didn't. States made what is called new international law. That started in 1945. It's fairly recent stuff. All other international law emanated from nations. That's why it's called international law. This is being sent about. And I would encourage, if you happen to have a copy, and I will leave a copy with the organizers of this conference, take a look at it. Because this is the language that nations themselves formulated, saying how they should relate to one another and how they should relate with states. And it is the basis upon which they will propose to the states a new relationship. And finally, I think what we can all do, and this is of course what everyone usually says, is know more. Pay attention to those articles that appear, however cryptically, in our local newspaper. Because, you see, I learned about 20 years ago when I first tried to get the New York Times to publish some of this stuff, And they said, that ain't news. Who cares about that? And I said, you guys are supposed to print everything that's fit to, you know, it's news that's fit to read or something like that. Yeah, but it's got to be news. I'm not kidding, that's what he said. It took 5 years before they started taking articles and putting them inside the A section in the back part to say, oh yes, something is kind of happening in some part of the world. And mostly that came about because about 5 of us started writing letters to the editor describing all these events going on around the world and asking them why the heck they didn't publish anything about it. We said, Reuters said something about it, you guys didn't even notice. Well, if you read the New York Times and perhaps the Toronto newspaper and even the Vancouver Sun, and I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know what the local paper's name is, they may have more of these articles even today. Most of you never heard of Chechnya before. Now you know, but you only know as the disaster occurs. Don't you think it would have been wonderful to know Chechnya when it was in its full flower and people were actually doing things kind of interestingly rather than dying? That's what I would hope we could preserve and encourage for the nations that are around us and among us. And it is in their interest and in our own interest that we must face down the anti-Indian movement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rudy. While you were giving your talk, I had a chance to glance at the BC Fire documents that were, some of you might have picked up as you came in, and I think your talk gave me some background context, at least some of the statements. I'll just bear with me while I read one or two of the statements. And it said, one says, Aboriginal title, if it ever existed, has been extinguished by the sovereignty of the Crown and by the benefits paid to Indians over the past years. I'm not making this up. Canadian Indians must move into the 20th century. Goes on to state land claims negotiations as such should be scrapped. These matters were decided over 130 years ago. Existing treaties and land claim settlements should have sunset clauses set into them. If this requires a constitutional amendment, then the necessary process should be set in motion. It goes on, and it makes for pretty interesting reading. Well, your comments certainly help us understand the larger context of how these comments are made, these statements are made. So, I would like to, we have time for some questions, and if there are questions, please raise your hand or